Hello, welcome to my talk. I didn't explicitly lie, but I did imply lying about reading. My name is Dr. Jessica Mason. I am a senior lecturer at the Sheffield Hallam University, and I'm really excited today to talk to you about some data that I collected back in the summer of 2019. The initial quote for this talk is taken from that data. So I'm just going to first start with a very brief overview of what I'm going to cover in this talk. So first of all, I'm going to start with a little bit of stuff around intertextuality and references to texts, and I'm just going to give you a few examples to demonstrate something that I claim as a sort of central tenet of a lot of my research, that references to texts are everywhere in conversations, in films, in other books, in all sorts of contexts of online and computer-mediated communication, as well as face-to-face. I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about some of the sociology of this book talk, of talking about texts and what happens when texts are brought into conversations or we encounter references to them. And the specific focus of the talk that I'm interested in today is this behaviour of lying about reading, as is suggested in the title. So what I'm going to try and do throughout this talk is synthesize some of the really fascinating research from areas such as psychology, both social and cognitive, as well as from linguistics around lying, how we do it, why we do it, what motivates people to lie, and bring that together with some reflections and investigations about reading. I'm going to talk to you about the Talking About Text project and who participated in it and how that data was gathered. And then I'm going to summarise and try and bring some of that together with some reflections that I think are important for us as stylisticians and people who are interested in reader response work around the role that lying might play in the sort of data that we often look at on a day-to-day basis. So I've just gathered a couple of these. I could go out right now and find you 10 more examples of these, but I'm always kind of on the lookout for references to texts, and so I'm just going to show you a few examples of these now. So this is one that I saw on Twitter just a couple of days ago. Imagine having an IQ low enough to enjoy watching Love Island, and somebody has commented on that. I got a first from Cambridge, bitch. I'll enjoy whatever I like. So we can see here one of the things I'm going to talk about a lot in this paper is that this isn't just a reference to a text, in this case Love Island, but all of the kind of the value judgments and identity work that go along with mentions of such texts, whether that's something which is kind of making associations between low intelligence or resisting that kind of narrative, and we can see both of those on display here. One that I found from a Boston Terrier Facebook group that I follow online to populate my social media with pictures of dogs and puppies. Cut my couch into pieces. This is my loudest balk. Fluffy canine, still teething. Don't give a heck about the living room seating. Now, interestingly, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, this is sort of a play, a parody on a song. If you don't know the song, you may not notice that there's a reference to the text going on here at all. And the same thing can happen in conversations when people quote lines from things or make references without perhaps naming the title or flag that they're referring to a text. There's some really interesting in-group, out-group work that can go on in this, where if you recognize the reference, you become part of that conversation, you become part of that group. If you don't, you may potentially feel a bit alienated from it. So references to texts are not just things that happen in a neutral way. They often come with connotations and consequences for not just our sort of sense of self, but our sense of belonging or not belonging to the part of a group, or whether or not we can contribute further to a conversation. Two interesting examples of this here. I'm reproducing these with permission, but presents that I bought for one of my friends who I believe is also at the conference, who will know who she is if she's watching it. But again, items of clothing, neither of which flag that they are referencing to particular texts, but if you look closely, you may notice that the leggings on the left have images taken from Alice in Wonderland, and the t-shirt on the right is a quotation from The Handmaid's Tale. And again, these are things that we see that often cross different medial lines. So the discussion here about Arthur Weasley, a reference to Harry Potter, but we actually have an image of the actor who plays that character in the image macro of this particular meme. And again, we can see that these things are, this is another reference to Harry Potter, but something which is used in perhaps not just to motivate people or for a bit of fun, as we've seen in other things. But actually, this is a very sort of politicized instance of references to texts. And again, we can see some of the interesting back and forth that happens on social media of somebody using Harry Potter as an example of being pro-life. And a reference at the bottom that's sort of outing this person's reading of the books, because, of course, if that's something that you are familiar with, you'll know that had Harry Potter not been the chosen one, that role would have passed to Neville Longbottom instead. So something really interesting going on here about the invocation of different texts being used for all kinds of wide variety of purposes. But we can also see tastes, preferences, and levels of knowledge being levied against people, often not in the friendliest way, which leads me on to thinking about this in relation to lying, because when we think about all of the different references to text that we may come across, our knowledge of text is not created equal. This is something which we incrementally develop in our long-term memory over the course of our lives as we interact with texts, which we then may or may not be able to access. So when we see a reference to a text, if we recognize it, we may soft assemble what I would refer to as a narrative schema, an individual's version of that text or tale in the mind. And that may have anything attached to it, from knowledge of that text, emotional or taste, kind of attitude-based reactions towards it, knowledge of places in which we've encountered it that may be positive or negative. So we all have this kind of mental archive, this library, internalized library of texts that we draw on. And when we encounter these references, these different narrative schemas that we soft assemble will inform our reactions to it, and may indeed spill forth into informing how comfortable we feel about the conversation that we're having when a particular text is brought up. So this is what I refer to as intertextuality in practice, and something that, if you're interested in, you can see my 2019 monograph of that very title. That these individual differences between recognition of references and reactions to references is really, really central to book talk. It's something which happens all the time, and indeed lots of conversations which are not actually focused on a particular text, as we might expect, for instance, in a reading group, but in any kind of social setting that we come across these kinds of references. Sometimes they're marked, sometimes they're flagged that there's a reference there. Sometimes, as the case with the leggings and the t-shirt that I've shown you, they're unmarked, and if you don't recognize them as references to texts, then you just pass on thinking that they are that a reference hasn't been made at all. So regardless of their form, these references to text force us to deal with them, especially if they're marked, if they're flagged. Some of these references will be to texts we are or are not familiar with, and they will invoke different responses and reactions. So some of you may have looked at for instance, the Handmaid's Tale t-shirt and not known that that was what it was a reference to until I've told you. That may evoke reactions in you of going, oh yes, okay, now that you've said it, I recognise this. You might think, I've got no idea what that's about. I've never come across The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know who it's by. Isn't that a television show? Some of you might think, oh yeah, that's brilliant. I really, really love The Handmaid's Tale. Some of you might think, oh no, it's too much for me. I really hate it. Or somebody who I don't like suggested I read it, or that I watch the series and therefore I never will. So essentially, to summarise that, these reactions that we have to references to text are in no way neutral, and often they have identity consequences. And I want to suggest in the rest of this paper that this means that individuals have all sorts of good reasons, and indeed some bad ones, to lie or misrepresent the truth when we talk about texts. And this leads me on to the Talking About Text project. So this was an online questionnaire that around 650 participants completed. It was completely anonymous, and it was asking all sorts of questions about people to reflect and share their own behaviours when they talk about books. So I personally am interested in texts of all type, whether that be film or television or written texts, but the focus of this study was very much on kind of written texts. It was predominantly completed by people who work in some sort of role in education. So you can see from the split there that a lot of academics, a lot of teachers, some librarians, and then a wide range of people in other professions as well. So I think that's important for us to bear in mind when I show you some of this data in a moment, because I think education as a context has particular factors that are important for us to bear in mind when we think about the potential identity consequences of being familiar with a text or not, of liking or disliking a particular text. One of the other questions asked, would you call yourself a reader? And again, you can see that the vast majority of participants said yes. And they were also asked roughly how many books do you read in an average year? And again, you can see that this is a very there is a very strong representation of people who read quite prolifically. And certainly when you compare this to national statistics, although I don't know what country of origin any of my participants are from, because it was important that they were anonymous and felt able to share because I was asking quite identity threatening questions. But compared to any national statistics that you can find, this is quite a high representation of books read a year. So these are some of the sorts of questions that I asked in talking about text projects. And these two are the ones that I'm going to focus on the responses of in this talk today. So have you ever read and enjoyed a book you'd be reluctant to tell others about? And are there any circumstances in which you might lie about reading a book that you hadn't read? So both oriented around kind of deceitful behaviours, and the second one sort of slightly more overt in asking that particular question. So this leads me on to thinking about the research that exists around lying. And I think an important place to start with this is what counts. Now, most of the literature from psychology, both social and cognitive, has a very kind of clear and quite consistent definition of lying, which is making some sort of statement. So it's normally framed as some sort of utterance, something which is verbalized, and it's often something which is conscious, something that people know to be false. It's a deliberate attempt to mislead, and you can see that reflected in some of the quotations here. There is an absolute agreement about this, however, and I think that this is important to reflect on when in a moment I show you some of the participant responses from my own research. There is research that tends to be oriented more around kind of therapy research and social psychology, which extends lying into thinking about unconscious intention as well as conscious intention. And there are also theorists who separate out different kinds of lying. So Bock and Ekman both talk about distinguishing lies of deceit from lies of concealment. And concealment essentially is lying by omission, so not making an overt statement you know to be false, but perhaps not correcting somebody, not sharing information, not correcting or allowing information that you know is inaccurate to go forth and people to continue to have that sort of impression. Now, what's really interesting about this is that straight away, so I asked this question about whether or not people would lie in an open narrative response. And then I coded that to see, to get a kind of quantitative figure about the percentage of participants who said that they'd lie. And what was really interesting about this is that there is not agreement amongst participants about what actually counts as lying. And given that lying is not typically viewed as a positive behaviour, perhaps that's unsurprising. So you can feel free to pause this talk if you want to have a read through these things in detail. But very interestingly, some people would say, yes, I do lie. And then some people would say, no, I didn't. And then go on to describe exactly the same behaviours, things like nodding along, things like not correcting people. So there is an interesting distinction, I think, there between what the research literature says about what counts as lying and what my participants appear to interpret as lying and how they feel about it. And this, I think, feeds into several paradoxes that exist around lying, which become very apparent as soon as you start to investigate the empirical evidence and the research literature around this more carefully. So it's generally, I think, fair to say that it's considered a poor or immoral or an unethical behaviour. Yet all of the empirical evidence points to the fact that it's a behaviour that we all engage in very frequently. There are different estimates depending on which study you look at. But the most conservative ones suggest that we all lie at least once or twice a day, with some people suggesting that it's much, much more frequent than that. It's also something which is considered a really important developmental milestone, with most children demonstrating their ability to lie from the ages of around 2 to 3, and most children showing a strong preference for lying, in particular if they stand to gain something from it, by the ages of around 6 or 7. And actually, when we look at this, we do not have, people who work in nurseries throwing up their hands talking about the immorality of the youth, because there are all sorts of reasons why we lie, many of which are actually quite positively motivated. So here is the split for you, the kind of quantitative split from the Talking About Text project. So 38.3% of the participants said that yes, they did lie, and 60.2% said that they didn't, in relation to reading specifically. However, as I've just mentioned to you, there is clearly a lack of agreement within this, of when you look at those people who you can reasonably code as saying, having said no, so part of that 60%, that they're still describing behaviours that at the very least you could describe or would fit with the literature's definition of lying by concealment or by omission. And people talk about this as well as behaviours that they don't engage in anymore, but perhaps have done in the past. And interestingly, many of them describe fear of getting caught as a key reason why they wouldn't lie. So again, thinking about the typical associations that are made with morality and lying, actually fear of getting caught, I would suggest, is sort of a more self-serving interest rather than thinking that it's a bad thing to do per se. And this, I think, is really interesting when you look around the paradoxes of lying in terms of our ability to detect it, because all of the research is very clear that humans are absolutely terrible lie detectors. Regardless of profession, so even people who work in jobs where being able to detect lying is really important, so things like judges, police officers, social workers, all the studies suggest that their ability to detect lies sits around chance. So they do about as well when they're trying to detect whether or not people are lying as they would do if they were guessing. And yet at the same time, we typically believe that we are much better at detecting lies than we actually are. So humans also typically kind of display a truth bias, something which intensifies the closer our relationships are. So we tend to believe that people are telling the truth. And the closer we are to people, we tend to believe that we will know if they are lying, where in fact, the opposite appears to be true. And perhaps this feeds into this finding that I've just discussed, that people describe a fear of getting caught as a reason not to lie, and that actually perhaps that fear is entirely misplaced. So in spite of these kinds of negative perceptions of lying, there are all sorts of reasons that we lie, and the research pulls out these three in particular. So we lie for self-serving reasons. I think that one's quite obvious. So things like failure to resist temptation and then feeling bad about it, leading to feelings like guilt, embarrassment, fear of punishment, I think a particularly interesting one to think about in an education context. Sometimes we lie for other people, so our motivation is to do around concealing another's wrongdoing. But there are also a huge number of lies which are what are referred to in the literature as pro-social. So a desire to continue interaction, it being good kind of social etiquette, to offer support or encouragement to other people, or bolstering other people's identity work or our own identity work. And this is something which comes across very clearly in the responses to the Talking About Texts project. So very often, actually, the reason why people lie about having read a book or having not read a book or liking a book is because they don't want to upset the other person that they're talking to. They don't want the conversation to stop. They think that there are positive benefits, like encouraging people to continue reading or continuing coming to the book group, or that it's going to perform some sort of social bonding. Because, of course, we often think that if we like the same sort of books, it will reflect on our ability to grow a relationship and a bond with that person, something which in my book Intertextuality in Practice monograph I refer to as the shared preferences myth. We do also, however, see lots of examples of self-serving lies, and often this is around wanting to appear more intelligent. I think really interesting to reflect on the schematic associations that are made between reading, and particularly reading certain texts that are viewed as challenging or being of some sort of importance, or being canonical, being associated with intelligence. Fear of sort of feeling inadequate or being viewed as ignorant, or losing respect. So all sorts of reasons, again, that also feed into our motivations to lie. And you can see this very clearly, this idea to want to stay as part of a conversation is something which comes up very frequently in the data. So people will often lie in relation to book talk in order to maintain a conversation. And often I think we also see this crossover between things that are pro-social but also self-serving. So whether that is wanting to finish a conversation with somebody who's asked you if you've read a book and wanting to avoid being chastised for not having read it, or you thinking that the conversation will end more quickly. I think very interesting to reflect on that one. I think participant 45, a really interesting one here about the idea that if you are someone's English teacher and a parent assumes that you've read a book, that you don't want to undermine that parent's confidence in your ability to teach their child. A desire to be part of an in crowd, wanting to a conversation to go on quicker. Or be viewed in a particular way within that conversation, perhaps as a source of authority. So to summarise then, I just want to offer a few reflections on the research that I've talked about today. I think the first, most obvious thing is readers do lie about reading, and that is clear because we all lie, and we all lie much more frequently than perhaps we allow ourselves to believe. And I think that this has important methodological implications for both the ways in which we gather reader response data and how we treat it. So when we go and record book groups, when we go and look at online data, I think it is important to bear in mind that there are perhaps motivations at play and contexts at play that mean that the things that readers say are not necessarily honest. Participants report lying about their reading for the full range of reasons offered in deception literature, but most notably in the Talking About Text project, self-serving and pro-social readings. And I think it's interesting for us to reflect on how the different contexts in which book talk takes place encourages different kinds of lying. So perhaps your motivations are more likely to be pro-social in a reading group and perhaps more likely to be self-serving, in particular in relation to things like punishment avoidance or kind of fear of embarrassment, perhaps in an educational context. And last but not least, I think readers' fears about getting caught in their lies appears to be something which is misplaced because humans are dreadful at lie detection. However, there is certainly, according to the responses that participants gave in this study, a suggestion that people lie less frequently than perhaps in relation to other topics in relation to book talk. However, are there certain contexts in which we are more likely to get caught if the lies that we are telling are about for example, our knowledge of a particular text? How long realistically can you go on in a book group pretending you've read a book when you haven't, when that is the sole focus of what is being discussed? So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop there, and I'd be really interested to hear anybody's reflections around this research and look forward to discussing it more with participants at the conference. Thank you very much.